The big question mark that's been raised with me by the folks in the military that I've been speaking of, regardless of their political persuasion, is where are the strategic wins here?
When it comes to that economic front, I just think of what President Trump said in that cabinet meeting this week, where he said, the Iranians, they're lousy fighters, but great negotiators.
If this is start to bring in those divisions, that's going to really complicate governing for Trump for the next 3 years.
Hey guys, how are you doing this week?
Hey, good, good. I am joining the podcast from Ireland, so it's a truly transatlantic president's path today.
It's hard to imagine this, but we're now at 1 month of war in Iran, and I thought this might be a good time for us to step back and see the different fronts that the U.S. is fighting and take a look at what aspects of this war the U.S. is perhaps very clearly winning and what aspects where the big struggles are, because we've been talking about that on the pod the last few weeks, but that really has crystallized, I think, in this past week, hasn't it?
I think, at least from a purely military standpoint, kind of putting aside the geopolitics of it all and the economic concerns, President Trump seems very, very pleased with how this has gone. And in almost every speech he's given, including completely unrelated speeches over the course of the last month, he cites some of the military successes, the Iranian Navy being largely destroyed, the relatively fewer number of drones and rockets being launched at Gulf allies and at U.S. bases. So I think purely from that standpoint, things seem to be going well. I think the problem then becomes what comes after or how that stops.
Yeah, speaking to some military folks in the last few days, there does seem to be pretty almost unanimous agreement that militarily this operation has been a success so far, as you say, Bernie, hitting those targets, but also with a relatively low casualty cost for the US military, if you're looking at it just in those sort of cold terms. There has been some damage to some of the US bases with the Iranian retaliation, and we don't have a full picture yet just as to the extent of that damage. But the big question mark that's been raised with me by the folks in the military that I've been speaking of, regardless of their political persuasion, is where are the strategic wins here? And how do you even start to measure strategic wins when there is such a grey area over what the best strategic outcomes were in the first place? And it goes back to that point that we've been saying for this whole month now of what exactly is the US after here. And people point time and again to the fact that President Trump did not do that sort of traditional sit down address to the nation at the very beginning of this war, as he was calling it in those early days. And now he says today he's not calling it war anymore. This past few days referring to it as anything from a small excursion to Iran to now military operation he's been using in the last few days. And all of the folks I've been speaking to saying, is it about regime change? Is it about getting rid of nuclear capabilities in Iran permanently? Or is it about stopping nuclear enrichment or uranium enrichment programs? The ballistic missile capabilities, which that does seem to have been, based on what we're hearing from this administration, completely taken out. But then you see Iran moving into the buzzword in DC these days, asymmetric warfare, where, because the president didn't lay out these objectives in the first place, it's hard to measure just how successful the outcomes have been so far.
I think kind of the unspoken thing that the White House hasn't mentioned, and really I think a large part of the American press hasn't really mentioned, is that this wouldn't be the first time that the U.S. military is very, very successful early on, only to face problems later. For an administration that says it wants to avoid the mistakes of past administrations, I think they're very kind of anxious about that suggestion. I mean, I just think about how quickly the Taliban government fell in 2001. Think about 3 weeks to Baghdad in 2003. I mean, if you go back even further, the Persian Gulf War went very well, only for Iraq to remain a problem for a very, very long time. I think the administration's very, very sensitive to the idea that they don't have a plan going forward. But what the problem, I think, for a huge chunk of the American public is that they really haven't laid out that plan in any real detail about what comes next for Iran, what role the U.S. will play in Iran in the future. Those are all kind of unanswered questions.
I think you're absolutely right about the administration being really happy about the way this has gone militarily in the first weeks of the war. I mean, clearly, President Trump saying 90% of missile launchers and missiles themselves have been destroyed. That is a massive part of Iran's ballistic missile program. Obviously, that is no longer operational. And he's also, in the past, we remember Operation Midnight Hammer talked about having completely obliterated Iran's nuclear sites. Despite that, there are signs that even on the military front, there are perhaps some unexpected responses from Iran that, as you said, Katrina, with asymmetric warfare, make a complete military victory difficult to assess here. Because if you look at the fact that President Trump is talking about even nuclear enrichment, he's been asked about what you do with the enriched uranium that is in Iran. Do you go in and get it? And he has said, well, if I said in the past, or he's asked, you said in the past that these nuclear sites are obliterated, so what more is this there to do? And he said, well, they can go down and get it, talking about rebuilding these nuclear sites and going to get that enriched uranium. And there hasn't been a real answer from the administration or from President Trump on what their plan is on that. And then think about the drones and the Strait of Hormuz. And I know we're going to talk about the economic impact of that, but just also as a military response from Iran clearly has been very, very effective. And it reminds you of previous wars where that type of guerrilla warfare tactic can be really destructive, even if there is some sort of truce down the road. That is a card that Iran can hold in its back pocket, if you will, to be able to strike back if there is any further military action in the future. And I think that's one that's kind of vexed the administration and its allies, certainly in the Gulf, because they've been on the receiving end of some of those tactics.
And it's hard to declare a military victory as long as your opponent is still fighting back, which is what we're seeing. And I suppose, the difference here is the US has gone in for, as we've been discussing, sort of vague or at least unexplained publicly the reasons for this, whereas the reason that Iran has is very clear, very unifying, and they will fight to the death, as we've heard and seen, and they will use all possible options and avenues available to them with all these drones. And as long as they can keep fighting in that way, okay, their navy is almost completely destroyed, but it doesn't remove the threat that they pose either. And the other complicating factor from a US perspective is that relationship between US and Israel now opening and, doubling, tripling down on its front in Lebanon, which is not sort of part of the US initial mission here. Yes, they spoke about wanting to stamp out the Iranian proxies, which of course would include Hezbollah, but I don't think they would have imagined Israel occupying 1/10 of the territory in Lebanon as something that they had planned for in the first early days of this war. So President Trump, should he decide to declare victory, which is, a lot of what the chat is about, isn't it, around DC circles these days, what does that mean for Israel? It has different war objectives, but how does it carry on if the US has decided to step back? And I suppose in keeping things vague from the outset, as we've been saying, it's harder to judge when does that point arrive.
I think the other possibility here is that even if President Trump does declare victory, that's not to say that the Iranians won't declare victory either. I think there's a very strong possibility that if the Islamic Republic's government infrastructure remains in place at the end of this conflict, that for them constitutes a victory, whether or not they had any real battlefield success against the United States. And with the Strait of Hormuz, it's an interesting one because also it's not necessarily just the threat to shipping going through the strait, it's the perception of the threat, because I mean the prices of goods hasn't gone up because of the ships sinking. They've gone up because of insurance costs and kind of, concerns on the back end of the supply chain rather than actually, ships blowing up in the strait, which we've only really seen a few of throughout the conflict. So, I mean, that's a card that Iran can play almost without actually having to physically play it. As long as that possibility is there, that's something that the Trump administration has to contend with.
And the perceived threat to the whole region as well, though. As long as there are drones flying around and missiles flying around, that's a problem for all the other countries in the region where holidaymakers like to go, for example. There's a lot of nervousness with, where I am in Ireland, a lot of people from Europe go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, these places for their holidays. And they're now thinking, well, I don't really want to be going holidaying somewhere where there is a threat, even if a victory has been declared over, tourism, which is a big part of the economy in some of these countries.
And that brings us, I think, to the economic front of this war, because we've talked about the U.S. being very successful on the military front. But when it comes to that economic front, I just think of what President Trump said in that cabinet meeting this week, where he said, the Iranians, they're lousy fighters, but great negotiators. And that perhaps is an interesting tip of the hat to the fact that Iran has been able to put a lot of pressure on the global economy and on the U.S. And that has really turned the tables for Iran in any sort of leverage it might have in negotiations going forward. I think on the economic front, we've talked here on the pod about just how dramatic the impact has been on oil prices, oil and gas prices, on fertilizer, and the knock-on effect that has on a number of products and on global shipping. And I was talking to the former Norwegian defense minister who was saying, look, us in Norway, yes, we have seen higher gas prices, but people forget we are one of the big shipping countries in the world as well, and we are impacted by this. And I asked, would that mean that Norway would then contribute sending ships to the Strait of Hormuz at some point? I should say he's no longer the defense minister, but regardless. And he said, at this moment, we're not part of this war. But you can imagine the longer this goes on, the economic impact really not only is severe at the moment, you're going to see the residues of it for weeks to come.
I think not just the international residue of it, but the domestic residue of it. Even if this conflict ends in the short term, those gas prices at the petrol pipe are still going to remain quite high. And that puts enormous pressure on Trump and Republicans domestically, having promised to bring down those gas prices and having previously pointed to gas prices as kind of a mark of success. I mean, the longer those remain elevated, in some parts of the country, they were $7, $8 this week, which is very, very high. I think that really complicates things for him domestically for months going forward, even if the fighting ends.
And the prices are higher in some places, I think California namely, than they were when Russia invaded Ukraine, which is when we saw the most recent spike in prices as well. And, they're hovering in and around the $4 a gallon average price across the nation. That's a very psychological barrier for people as well, where it sort of starts to have, an impact on, well, where is the economy going? There's, we'll talk about polling in a bit, but there was one of the polls out this week where a majority of people felt the US is heading for a recession this year, which just speaks to that long-term effect that even if, there's a peace plan or a ceasefire or some kind of deal negotiated in the next coming days, and that is a gigantic if, we should say, that the knock-on impact will be there for so long, particularly on fertilizer, as we've spoken about before, on the impact of produce that drives up inflation, that has a knock-on impact right across the board. And then consumer sentiment gets impacted, which then you get a nervousness. People don't want to spend money. Companies don't want to spend money that already was there because of the tariff threat from last year. So you have all of these factors just layering on top of each other that makes for a very uncertain and nervy time. And, we love to talk about the midterms on this podcast, but it's making, I think, lawmakers now who were a bit bullish about this get nervous as well.
They certainly are. And, I think it's interesting, the number of Iran analysts I've spoken to who have worked under all of the administrations from, Bush to Obama to Biden and Trump, of course, in between. And they have all said that Iran does see itself as winning this economic war. It sees that it can really impact the global economy in a way that perhaps hadn't been anticipated by the Trump administration and not by its allies either. And because of that, it knows that in negotiations, it has a real, as I was saying earlier, card to play. And in that sense, you do wonder how President Trump is going to negotiate with this administration when it comes to actually reopening the Strait of Hormuz. He was asked about this. What would that look like? He was asked by CNN, and he said, I don't know, could be joint control, me and the Ayatollah controlling the Strait of Hormuz. But the reality is that any disruption there going forward is going to continue to rattle the markets again. And we see that impact. We've seen these wild swings on the markets for the prices of oil and gas. And the impact is not just, of course, for, the biggest producers of oil and gas. It's all of Asia, as we've talked about, that receives a big amount of their oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, but also liquefied natural gas production facilities. This in the Gulf region has actually had a massive impact to the extent that they say it will take, and we were talking about this with analysts on our shows this week, could take up to 5 years to replace that capacity. And that is, a real global problem for countries that are still relying on oil and gas. And that includes not just the U.S.'s allies, but the U.S. itself.
And I was speaking to a few people who were involved in negotiations with Iran in past administrations. And they were saying, negotiations like this come down to individual countries' ability to inflict pain on their opponent and their sort of preparedness to accept pain being inflicted on their nation. And you have to say that Iran has a very strong track record of not really caring about what happens to its people, a litany of human rights abuses. And we saw all the protesters being murdered earlier in the year. So it can absorb that pain for longer. And because of their sort of stated opposition to the United States, they can inflict a lot of pain, as we've been discussing, their economic pain in particular around oil and gas prices and the global economy. But on the US perspective, the pain they're inflicting is military at this point, and their preparedness to accept pain, that threshold possibly is lower. Being an election year, as we've said, the impact on the economy, the knock-on of that. So, some of the negotiators I was speaking to were saying there's kind of a mismatch there. And although there's the military victory, if you like, from the US perspective, they're not necessarily on a level playing field on all fronts in these negotiations or talks about talks. I mean, even trying to get a sense of where those negotiations and talks about talks are even at is quite difficult, which, is always the way, right? As most of this goes on in back channels and behind closed doors, as much as we would like them to come on our shows and tell us all about how it's going. So there's a bit of guesswork involved, but sort of experienced negotiators are watching this with quite an arched eyebrow.
There's also a challenge for the Trump administration in that Iran could work on a longer time frame. They've always said from day one that they'll keep going as long as this takes. But at the same time, President Trump keeps going back to this 4 to 6 week timeline he set out at the beginning of the war. And him and other White House officials, Caroline Leavitt, for example, they keep saying that they're ahead of schedule. So that kind of puts a clicking tick-tock on any sort of outcome here, because people are now kind of expecting them to wrap things up within a relatively neat time frame. And the Iranians have the capacity to keep this going much, much longer, which really kind of complicates that messaging. I think in retrospect, many people in the White House will think that 4 to 6 week deadline for having most of this wrapped up will probably be kind of a communications mistake to have said that.
Well, it started as days, didn't it? It was a multi-day operation at the beginning.
It did. And I think what is really indicative of what you just said, Bernie, is if you look at the polling. I was looking at this latest CBS YouGov poll, and the question was asked about the U.S. taking military action against Iran. And on March 3rd, which was fairly shortly after the U.S.-Israeli military operation began, the disapproval was 56%. And now when they were asked again 2 weeks later, that had ticked up to 60%. And that really reflects many of the polls that we've seen across the spectrum, which is that there isn't a lot of support for this war. There is real concern about how long it's going to take. And the longer it takes, the more Americans are concerned about the impact on their wallets, on gas prices, of course, but really on the country. There's a sense in the polls, and this question is asked in pretty much every poll that I've seen, does this make the U.S. more safe? And the answer is many people there are saying it does not.
There was a Fox News poll out on Wednesday as well, which put President Trump's disapproval level at the highest of any point during both of his terms. 59% of the registered voters that they surveyed did not approve of President Trump's handling of his entire presidency at this point. And then when they were asked about his foreign policy agenda specifically, 62% disapproved of his handling of foreign policy overall, and 64% when asked specifically about his handling of the conflict with Iran said they didn't approve of how he was approaching it. So they're really massive figures, aren't they, for things like this?
And the White House is really quite dismissive of those polls. But at the same time, also, I think people in the White House have to be wondering how much of this is driven by dissatisfaction among people that previously supported him. Recently I've spoken to a few people who voted for him for the first time in the last election, thinking they were going to get one thing. And now this war in Iran has kind of laid bare that perhaps they're having little buyer's remorse, especially on the foreign policy front. No new wars, I think, was a message that really resonated with a lot of people. And it's hard for Trump to argue now after a month of conflict that he didn't start any new wars, especially when it's something long and kind of at the moment open-ended, as opposed to Venezuela, for example.
I've seen really President Trump's closest MAGA supporters, including his vice president, J.D. Vance, try to change the messaging on that as the war has moved on to say, well, it's not that there wasn't going to be any new wars. It's that, as J.D. Vance has said, previous presidents were, quote, dumb, and this is a smart president who knows how to execute these wars in the best way to make the U.S. safe. And I wonder how well that messaging will work. I mean, we've talked about some of the disquiet among the real right-wing influencer crowd, the MAGA crowd that is not happy about this war. And I've also spoken to some Republican lawmakers, and I do find interesting that the goalpost seems to keep moving. And initially it was, if there's any military action, it's something that we definitely need to talk about. Now it's, if there's going to be ground troops, that is something that we should definitely be consulted on, or at least some members of Congress believe that Congress should be consulted on that. And you're starting to see the question of whether there should be more military funding. If there is a supplemental funding request from the White House, you're starting to see some Republican members of Congress, like Nancy Mace and others, say, I would not vote for more funding for this war. And even in the House Armed Services Committee and Senate Armed Services as well, they are concerned that they're not getting enough information from the administration on what exactly is going on. And I find the fact that that is being aired a bit, at least publicly, is we're starting to see a little bit of that daylight between Republican lawmakers and the White House.
We've often said that it seems like President Trump has a stranglehold on Republicans on Capitol Hill. I mean, I think if this is start to bring in those divisions, that's going to really complicate governing for Trump for the next 3 years. Once people feel emboldened to speak out, and if their constituents feel they need to, I think they'll hear a lot more kind of pushback from Republicans in Congress that we hadn't really had before on really most topics.
I think, though, there's a difference between speaking out about it and taking action, because the other big thing that was happening this week, of course, is this whole row over funding the Department of Homeland Security, paying the TSA agents and others in those big queues at the airports, and President Trump attaching the Save America Act, which is about basically requiring people to prove their citizenship in order to register to vote. We saw many Republicans pleading with the president, remove that attachment, because we have a deal that Republicans and Democrats have reached a compromise on to fund the Department of Homeland Security, reopen all of it, keep the ICE part separate, and they'll keep negotiating and talking on that. And he seems resolute, and the Republicans can't seem to bowl him over, the congressional Republicans at least. So I think he does still have that stranglehold on the party, even if we're starting to see folks talk about it. And I think the longer and longer that this war effort comes on, perhaps that starts to change. The more people are facing tough primaries, and then as we get nearer the actual ballot day in November. But, are we in a situation where the world is at war till that point? That's a whole other kettle of fish. And we will talk about it all here on the podcast.
Enjoy Ireland. Great to see you guys. And I guess we'll talk again next week.
See you guys soon.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so do please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.